Welcome to FOB TV, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist and lecturer here at TCS, and I want to welcome all of you to the program today. I'm really excited to introduce today's guest. Our guest is Roger Spitz. Roger, thanks for joining us.
It's fantastic to be on, Kevin. Really glad to be on Future of Business. Thanks for having me.
Now, if you guys don't already know Roger, you really should. I mean, let me read through his bio here. He's the chair of Disruptive Futures Institute, president of Tech Essential, board director, venture capitalist, best-selling author of Disrupt with Impact. He's a keynote speaker, and we're going to have fun today. Thanks for being on the show today, Roger.
Super looking forward to it, Kevin. Love your program.
So let's just talk about this. Where are you calling in from today?
So I'm in San Francisco today. I travel a bit like many people, but today I'm in San Francisco. It's kind of our HQ.
Now, I don't really detect a San Francisco accent. Where's the accent come from?
Fair enough. There's a lot going on there. So I don't know if the show is a few hours, but I'm born in South Africa.
Okay.
I lived in a bunch of different countries from just all over the world, and spent a lot of formative years at school in Monaco. And so speak French, but spent most of my professional and university years in the UK. So you might have a sort of half South African, half UK, half Eurotrash.
There you go.
And in the US, California since 2017. So it's my 8th year having left the UK.
How long, Roger, have you been practicing foresight and talking about the future?
So thinking about the future quite a long time, because I was in my prior role, I was global head of mergers and acquisitions covering technology. So I advised a lot of, the CEOs, boards and investors on the acquisitions, the divestments, or when you're sort of speaking to investors on an IPO, you're forward looking. So I'd say from a kind of strategic side, a long time. In a more structured way, and the way you and I would understand foresight, I'd say just shy of a decade. I've been studying it more seriously. And in terms of practicing it and writing about it in a kind of more 100% of my time dedicated manner, probably about 5 years, I'd say.
Wow. So your book, again, Disrupt with Impact. Tell us kind of what's the themes that you're digging into in this particular book.
Yeah, so no, thanks for the mention, and here it is, kind of full cover. The premise is quite simple. It's really around three key words. One is disrupt. We don't use it in a technocentric Silicon Valley sense. We use it in the sense of breaking the status quo, either because the status quo as it is not going to help us with the challenges of the world. So, there's a kind of failure in our education, governance, and incentive structures. So we need to rethink and disrupt things to drive change, a virtuous change. And so that's kind of the disrupt. The impact is that there's a lot of change for change. And for it to be impactful, it has to be effective. And there's the difference between efficient or just ticking a box and effectiveness. So the idea of disrupt with impact is how do you drive change in a manner that's effective? And then the third key word, which is really an enormous focus of the book and our work, is unpredictable. Achieve success in an unpredictable world. This idea that, not only is the world not stable, predictable, linear, or controllable, but relying on the assumptions that it's linear and predictable is increasingly costly and dangerous. So what does it mean to have an operating system and a decision-making in this deeply unpredictable world? So that's really what we're looking at. What's changing? What isn't? How do you drive the virtuous tipping points, the inflection points, the ones that are sort of positive, and do so in an effective way?
Well, thank you for sharing that. So let me just ask, do you consider yourself an optimistic or a pessimistic futurist?
So fundamentally, I would say I'm what I call, or what many people call, informed optimist. So I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but it's to do with I think it's called the Stockdale paradox, where you have, people in a sort of prisoners, and they had, do you sort of look at life all come rosy, naive? Do you kind of consider that it's, everything's finished? Or do you kind of see what facts you have, reflect on the elements, update it in an informed manner with a view of finding pathways to, so I'm fundamentally in that camp of informed optimism. And philosophically, I very much believe in agency. I believe that, people like the Snyder hope theory with, you need pathways and agency and hope to build, positive perception of the world. And you need agency for that. So to exercise the agency, you need to be positive. What I would say, though, is that two things. One is agency is an option. So if you don't exercise it doesn't exist. So to feel optimistic, not only do I need to be exercising agency, but humanity, society needs to exercise agency. And we're not necessarily always seeing that. The second thing is that the philosophical background is existentialist philosophy. So you exist and you create your beingness, and that agency is very positive. But there are also inflection points and tipping points. And I think the challenge we have, and my own personal challenge as I think about the world and my own predicaments as a human in this world, is when you have certain inflection points which are not virtuous, and these from climate to societal to geopolitical, nuclear to some of the good things, but also challenges of technology and AI. When you have these inflection points, and when, as humanity, we're not necessarily exercising the agency and developing the right pathways, then I lose a little bit of optimism, because that informed optimism is completely updating. And, anybody who's updating themselves these days, we're seeing that we're reaching certain tipping points. And that concerns me, even compared to, and I don't think it's specific to any individual or country or specific aspect. I think that there's a lot happening that is concomitant, which are bring us closer to some adverse tipping points, which kind of chip into my optimism.
Yeah, Roger, I think I haven't developed the terminology as you have, but I share, I think, a lot of those sentiments. As a futurist myself, I can't imagine simply not believing that there's hope. And the ability as a futurist is not only to see what's possible, but also to find those pathways.
Yeah.
How do we actually make something happen? I don't see myself as a journalist, an objective journalist that sits back and says, okay, the world's, going to hell. Oh, well, I better report on that. No, I see that as the role of a futurist is not only to report, but to find in that struggle, to find the hope and find out what we can, the agency to actually make the world a better place. So thank you for sharing that. I think I share a lot of those same sentiments. So let's talk about AI. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring that up. Let me talk about your personal experience. How often are you using generative AI platforms, and what are you using it for?
On a personal level, I've been exposed to it for some time in different ways. Even in my professional capacity, I was advising on M&A and venture capital investments and that. So AI has been a feature that we've been kind of following and in equity stories and in strategy and that for some time. And I would say that a few years ago, and in fact, to your earlier point around agency, we'll do the link with AI and my journey and agency. The Disruptive Futures Institute, really the remit is giving, tools and agency and pathways to be more, better future prepared and more resilient. And one of those is really understanding the agency we have with things. So my filter to AI and my own personal journey is one where I think hard around the interaction of humans with AI and where is AI good at, where are humans good at, and to your point, if you're forward looking, what is it? How can that pan out going forward? What is the future of AI and decision making as they cohabitate? Before moving into careers and all that, I had a particularly strong passion for philosophy and existential philosophy. And so it's linked to this idea of agency. And one of which is existential philosophy, which is you exist and then you create yourself. And in that you have freedom, agency, and choice. Things are not predetermined. And when I look at AI, I like to think about what still gives me and humans agency and what So where is it supporting, where is it not supporting? And the way I find useful to look at AI is in terms of the decision-making value chain, the difference between, maybe descriptive, predictive, and then prescriptive. And then, so predictive, it doesn't mean it can predict, but it means you then see what the algorithms are telling you, and then you take them from there to make decisions, which then are prescriptive. And I think for me, where I draw a kind of line with my views on AI and my own experience of AI is between decision support and decision making. So the kind of descriptive, predictive versus prescriptive. And we can unpack that a bit later, give you my views on where I think AI can be better and where AI has shortcomings. But in that triage of decision making, I always kind of ask myself, okay, what am I trying to do? And can AI be useful for that?
Yeah.
By using AI, am I excluding other approaches which might have other virtues? And then am I relying on what AI is coming from? So I use it a reasonable amount day to day and in a conscious manner. I say conscious manner because I think as humanity, we are all using it all day without realizing. And that I think is one of the key issues, is how much are we actually able to exist and make decisions without AI, not necessarily because we choose to always rely on AI for it, but just because the social media, the news we get and everything is in the end driven by AI, the political voices, the polarization, the lot of things. So there's a lot that we're kind of not able to disassociate ourselves from AI. And that I'd say, fortunately or unfortunately or whatever, but most individuals are spending a lot of time using AI without necessarily being aware of it. And then in a conscious way, which is probably more your question, I would say I use it for two things primarily. One is A/B testing. In other words, because everything is digital now, you can A/B test everything. And so if I have something very specific that's already articulated and clear in my mind, it can be interesting to kind of, and I don't rely on one AI. So I'm going to use Claude, Gemini, et cetera, all at once, complexity, et cetera, and literally have alternative language, alternative ideas, et cetera. And just simply, as you would A/B testing, get the views from the different LLMs. So the A/B testing is of some use, I find. And then there's the research, like Gemini has, the deep research facility and various other things, which aren't bad. What I would say, though, is that I try and be very mindful of not conflating the journey with the outcomes. And I think a lot of the use of AI is cutting away from the journey of discovery, even in research. So, of course, in writing and that, I never use it, just simply because I think it's dangerous in terms of idea creation. I've written a lot over the past few years, and it's the journey, the research, the iterations, the blank pages that have allowed me to connect things, come up with new things that I don't think are out there in a conventional way. And if I were to rely on AI, not only would it be a sort of common denominator of what's kind of available, but it would almost be that I'm reaching directly that outcome and not getting that maturity, that connection of different ideas that seem unrelated, the next order implications of things. And I think that conflation of the journey, which is a discovery process, which is a creative process, which is iterative, when you're then just going straight to what the sort of result is, I think is dangerous. So I'm very kind of discerning with that. And it comes back to that decision-making value chain of humans and AI and what you're delegating to whom,
That's very interesting. To me, it seems like this is democratizing that capability across a much larger audience where they may not be able to get to your level of discovery and connecting the dots, but they're able to accomplish a lot more than they ever could on their own. What do you think about that?
I think like everything, there's not just kind of good or bad or useful or useless. I think the whole feature of our complex world and the beauty of it and the nuances of it are that they're paradoxes and contradictions and that. So they are both things at the same time. I think it's both very good in terms of democratizing access to information and many very practical things. I would, however, caution one aspect which I do think applies to humanity, which is the question and the challenge, I think, for humanity is the following. Insofar as it's very accessible at the touch of a button, and insofar as that is kind of currently things that are more scarce or that are requiring payment and that. So that might be very good. And, it's not for me to opine whether it's good or bad or, what do I know? But what I would say is it's interesting to look at the implications of that. In other words, if you take the value of knowledge, if you take the value of legal advice, if you take the value of, consulting and strategy reports, and if we consider that all of that is available at a touch of a button, including the descriptive aspect of recommendations and advice and that, then the question becomes what is value? Is there value for knowledge? Is there value for... So I think that's a question as humanity we have to ask ourselves in the current educational systems and the current economic models, where there is some transactional value in terms of having some of this knowledge or what have you. What becomes of that, those capabilities, those knowledge, if they're kind of readily available? And that brings us to quite important questions. And then so that's literally, to be a bit tangible, future of a lawyer or architect or designer or, And I think that brings me to a second point, which is we are in a complex world where things are not so easy always to understand or realize where we're being maybe oriented, not to say manipulated, and etc. And I think if we both just established in the past few minutes that the value of knowledge per se, and maybe to a degree the current educational systems, I mean, these are not your words, but mine, are maybe limited because they're very focused on knowledge base. And a lot of the challenges for our world will therefore be less around just knowledge or expertise per se, right? Nothing wrong with expertise and science. Right. It's magical, but it might not be the humans that contribute to the expertise in straightforward way. At the same time, some of the biggest challenges for humanity are complex. In other words, they are unknown. There isn't a straightforward answer at this point in time. It's in a nonlinear, complex environment. It's trial and error. It's a discovery process. And for that, machines are not necessarily better. In other words, drug discovery or how to send a probe to Mars, I think machines are very good at because it's linear, it's predictable, it's known unknowns, and you can rely on, there are a range of right answers for a particular question. And that's great. Amazing what vaccines can be created in what speed and incredible things. The challenge is, if you look at the challenges for humanity around, geopolitical, societal, AI itself, climate, etc., if there was a simple plug and play answer to that, we would kind of know.
Right.
And like in terms of resolving it, of course, we understand the drivers of climate change. We just don't necessarily know what pill we can have or click right to resolve it, right? In a way that is effective, works for the economic models, for the different dogmas of society, etc. So the challenge is, if we're delegating a lot of the decision outcomes to machines, if we're less good ourselves at decision making in these complex environments where there's still things to be discovered, where there's, the danger is that we are not necessarily very, very well versed in terms of, or very useful in terms of the easy knowledge-based things, because machines can do that. And we're not necessarily good at resolving the complex challenges. And so the danger is, what is our utility for the things that, yes, we're comfortable with, and that's currently what we do and learn and all that. But is it of value if you can just click a button? And then at the same time, what are we doing to upgrade our human capabilities to resolve some of the more challenging, complex problems we have? And if we're just delegating that to machines aren't necessarily better today in complex, unpredictable, unknown discovery process environments. And so that for me is a danger for humanity. I'm not denying the magic, the beauty, the benefits for many different type of situations and that. I'm just taking a step back on some of the dynamics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm a big fan, as you are, in the use and the capabilities that I'm discovering in a wide range of these generative AI platforms. And I do it by committee, as you do too. I have a whole group of these platforms, and I'm asking them to argue the point back and forth, to look for invalid statements from each other, to improve each other, all of that. And as a committee, we come up with some fun stuff sometimes. So I'm pretty excited about that. But one of the challenges that happens to me all the time is that I will ask some deep business question about business strategy, and generative AI comes up and says, sustainability is the number one issue. And I look at it and I'm saying, no, it's not. These business leaders are looking to, to cover their expenses, to make a profit, to give a return to shareholders, to improve the quality of their products, the quality of their brand. When I look at this, and it seems to have all these generative platforms a heavy bias toward sustainability is the top priority of business people. I've not found that in my own experience to be the case. Is down the list a little bit. There's all these other things, the KPIs that are above that. Am I wrong in my interpretation of that, or my looking at biases, or is that really the highest priority of business people today?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different aspects there, and this is a great way of framing it, Kevin. So thanks for the different dynamics on that. And so a few thoughts for what they're worth. I think, first of all, yes, there's invariably bias in the LLMs, as they are in humans, as they are in many things. So there's definitely that, and this, I would say, is probably slightly one notch above bias. It's probably intentional because of certain messaging to deflect from what one might consider to be also, adverse environmental things. And that, so it kind of allows maybe some of the hyperscalers to tweak some of the messaging around that, which is fine. Everybody understands that, and everybody pushes forward the messaging of their own businesses and that, and so pushing sustainability forward, etc. The second thing I'd say is, it's interesting that you use the word today, right? Because things are shifting, and they shifted before in the US, the 20th of January, or whatever the date was. They've been shifting for the past few years. The reality is that, even if you look at the big asset managers, BlackRock and others, for all the kind of virtues of some of the talks 10 years ago, which were very encouraging, the reality is that there's been a U-turn on these topics for at least 3-4 years, and very visibly for 2 years, and 2025, unfortunately, that much more so. So there is this kind of U-turn. However, I would add the following nuance, which can give us some pathways to hope, but not overcooking it either, which is the following. I think we've moved from a phase which is, let's pretend it's all magical and wonderful and everybody's going to do that, and then people kind of just did the U-turn. So that was like BlackRock 10 years ago, Paris agreements, all of that. Then I think that over the past few years, there's been a U-turn on that, and it's just been degraded in terms of prioritization. But I think there's a different kind of evolution today, which has merit as well. It's not enough momentum, and I don't want to be positive on something which is so much, a cliff, but still noteworthy, which is the following. Which is, in the end, all of these key underlying drivers of change will affect trillions of value, both value creation and value destruction. And so even if you're not looking at it from a broader stakeholder perspective, but purely shareholder value, and even if you're just looking at your bottom line and your investors' returns, even if you're having that very selfish shareholder primary view of the world, you can't ignore it, because, and it's quite interesting, I think it's JP Morgan who recruited the ex-head of NOAA for a new climate advisory practice, and they have a new initiative called Climate Intuition, and they've written their first paper a few weeks ago. But fundamentally what it's saying, and I do see that with my own interactions, and I'll give you sort of a debrief in a second, but what they're saying is, effectively, if you're not taking climate and sustainability into decision making, it's going to affect the bottom line. And so you're now reaching, which is very concerning as well, incidentally. It means the urgency is here. You're no longer just in the mitigation that you're really in the adaptation and building the resiliency in that. But the reality is that when you're filming the fires from your iPhone, or when you can no longer kind of insure certain regions because of climate, you know, it's affecting businesses in a million different ways. And the million different ways will include physical assets, transition risk, financial risk, all the different aspects. And those are tangible and happening today.
Yeah.
And therefore, in the end, the management team, the boards, whether they're trying to sort of tick a box, do what's right for the planet or whatever, even if they just look at shareholders, they have to integrate climate resiliency and elements of mitigation just to kind of survive. Because if you have 300 hotels in the world and you're not resilient for extreme weather, you're going to have a problem. Absolutely. If you have servers or data centers that can go down, then, you know, if your tarmac is melting, you know, so in the end, even though it might be for sort of a different way, you have the economic reality whereby organizations are forced to think about it. And the final comment I would say maybe is from our own experience. One of the reasons, you know, we have the Disruptive Futures Institute, which is education, and we publish a lot and content, how to sort of be better future prepared. But I have a foresight practice, you mentioned earlier, called Tech Essential, which effectively is strategic foresight. And in that, we have a climate academy, and we work a lot on the energy transition and many different projects in Brazil, trying to transform the carbon credit markets and all kinds of things. And what I would say is that I'm seeing it today. You're seeing people are no longer just sort of saying, okay, what can we say or press release can we do to please constituents, because they don't care and they don't feel obliged to do that anymore. But they are worried about what are we missing that might hit our business and that we need to build resiliency for. And in that, they also realize that there's regulations that's starting to take place and that there's certain constraints, and that effectively they do need to emit less carbon and rethink manufacturing processes and materials technology and all that. So I wouldn't say it's satisfactory or with the urgency that's required, but I would say that it's not just there's a U-turn, people are less worried about it and therefore ignoring it. I would say that it's just shifted, it's manifesting itself in a different form of decision making.
To me, it sounds like the tide has come in and they have to respond now.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. And part of the tide is the literal tide of the climate effect. Yeah. And part of it is, you know, there's not enough regulation and there's some terrible watering down and all that. But there is still an environment where over the next few years, many important regions of the world and Europe and elsewhere are putting through legislation. And that legislation will be law and it will be required. And so I think, like all things, it's not like because one particular country or moment is doing certain things that it means that, you know, organizations can ignore the law, that all those legal environments are disappearing, you know.
So when I first got out of college and got into business, Roger, there was kind of this rule where you just didn't bring up religion and politics when you're talking in business environments, because your job is to focus in on business and just get it done and get out and don't cause any waves. Today, it doesn't seem like that's possible. I mean, politics, even if you're trying to avoid them, they're interrupting and disrupting your everyday business activities. I just think of all these, I read often articles in the paper where, you know, a CEO goes to sleep and they're comfortable and they wake up in the morning and the world's gone to hell and their product is now under boycott by some other organization. You're like, how did that happen overnight? I didn't see that coming. So politics seems to have intruded and invaded into so much of that. What advice are you giving to business leaders today on how to respond, even if they want to avoid, you know, finding themselves in the middle of those kinds of controversies?
So I agree with the observation. I think, you know, it's you know, in a rule-based world where there wasn't necessarily social media, which incidentally is AI to our earlier discussion, there was a different kind of exposure in that. You know, for us, we try and look at the fundamental underlying drivers of change, right? And in doing so, I'd have a few observations, and this is kind of the advice we give. And we actually do a lot of work in anticipatory governance with boards. There are a few different elements. The first one is simply we're in a world of radical transparency and traceability. So anything that is said, articulated, or whatever will crop up. So, whether you're looking at the Cayman Files on tax evasion, whether you're looking at whatever it is, you should, and that has problems as well. But one has to consider that everything is radically transparent and traceable and available. The second element is we are in a world which is deeply polarized. And so there are influences at stake, which we can unpack some other time or later if you wish, but which means that that line between fact, reality, truth, etc. There can be different interests which are pushing whether it's truths or untruths or whatever, which can affect any individual or company at any time. So that's one of the dynamics which are prevalent, irrespective of whether one's political or apolitical, what one might have said or not said, or believed or not believed. So that's part of that element of context as well. And then I would add to that the reality is that these things are affecting value. So you have to understand them and be interested in them because geopolitics affect value. So, recently JP Morgan, actually, I just did the link now with the climate advisory. And so they are, always ahead of the game in that. And of course, for reasons that make sense, they have recently put in position of a chief geopolitical officer or someone similar to the climate advisory role who's advising the investors, clients, etc., geopolitically. Okay. And the question with that is, and there is this kind of increasing vogue of chief political officer, that the danger is also to treat it as separate from everything else, because what's happening, in a systemic world, all these drivers of change are interacting and cascading, right? And when there's a conflict or war somewhere or geopolitical event, it's also affecting cyber and food security and energy security and everything, and manufacturing and supply chain, etc. So the reality is that I would say there is an element whereby you have to understand, form a view, and then choose how to respond and anticipate geopolitical events. But it's also just because it's a key driver of change, and you can't isolate it. It's like the World Economic Forum risk report. You can't treat each risk as isolated and just take them one by one. The fact is that they interact and cascade and they're systemic. And that's how you need to be thinking in terms of being future prepared and resilient. And so geopolitics, for me, in our advice to kind of boards and decision makers and that, it's just very important to take it into account, but to take it into account in a way that thinks about how it connects to other things and what are the next order implications of geopolitical events. And that's maybe not your exact question as to how exposed one might be or how one should express one's views or not. But my final comment in relation to maybe that specific point is you have to have an understanding of all this as to how it might affect you, your business, etc. And then because of everything we've just said, I actually think that storytelling and narratives need to be part of the DNA of an organization. And it's not necessarily just to put a spin or press release, etc. It's just to understand the implications of what we've just been discussing, which is any second, anything can happen that affects how you are perceived or your company is perceived, irrespective of what you said, didn't say, believe, don't believe, etc. And so that exposure in an amplified, exponential social media world of instantaneity is absolutely, critical. If you think of how Silicon Valley went bust, it's because on Sand Hill Road, you had one of the VCs mentioning to a portfolio company, I hope you don't have all your money with SVB, Silicon Valley Bank. And then 10 seconds later, a few hundred million people knew, because in a social media world, that's different from 2008 with the financial crisis, which didn't have the same amplification with social media. So the point around geopolitics for me is understand that it's a key driver of change that's systemic, so not to treat it as isolated, and understand today what storytelling, narratives means, and to therefore constantly prepare for building your own direct messaging to markets, to communication, etc., and understanding what can you put in place to kind of anticipate some of these things which could happen in time.
So Roger, on a daily basis, I look at this big framework that TCS created and invested some intellectual property into. It's this creating this model, which we call the convergence model. where we track basically the 400 largest forces of change, if you would. And it's really hard to look at because they're like cells on a spreadsheet. And you look at it and there's there's the whole section on bioengineering and another section on AI, and another section on, communications, 6G, 5G, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, so this big board with 400 trends on it, if you would. I'm looking at those every day and I'm just salivating because I can see how the world could experience so much good from those things. I mean, this is longevity. This is getting rid of cancer. This is getting rid of, all these different bad things out there. This is helping. This is green technology. It's going to help with sustainability. This is, all these things on the board there. So as a futurist, staring at that and communicating those ideas daily, I'm always excited and I want to bring forward those things to make the world a better place. Yet I go out and I talk to so many people, and when they think about the future, they're just plain sad. They're afraid. They don't want what they see coming in the future. And it's just such a difference as a futurist that can see all the good and others that just see sadness and things that make them afraid. Do you encounter that challenge? How do you respond to that kind of environment?
Yeah, it's that observation, right, of the duality and the tensions and paradoxes of these things, right? And you're right, the list, if, with the right agency, with the right mindsets, with the right education, governance, and incentive structures, the ingredients are there for humanity to be incredible, right? I wouldn't necessarily over-index how much would come from a technology necessarily, right, but a combination of things. And they are amazing things, if you think about, drug discovery or some of the progress in longevity and, curing diseases. And there's some phenomenally incredible things that can be supportive. I would put a few things in perspective. I would like to think that all these are supporting some fundamental aspects, right? So if you take longevity, you're seeing some drugs, which is not really longevity, but, obesity drugs or whatever. I'd like to think that, or take climate, that somehow the fundamentals of what humanity needs to be thinking about to mitigate better, to build resiliency and adaptability is not relying on a kind of quick fix or technology solution. It's not to say that it can't support. So the way I try to look at it is, how is that supporting other fundamental initiatives that are able to change the systems, right? And so that's one element. And then the other element, I guess, is how many other things are kind of playing a counterbalancing role to not enable those to manifest themselves, right? So if you're looking at, of course, the powers of, we talked about it earlier, healthcare or education, and AI and technology can support the democratization of knowledge and information. But if in parallel to that, we're not upgrading the educational system to make humans relevant and critical thinking and creative in light of the diminishing potential value of knowledge through machines, and in addition to that, if the role someone is exposed to with AI is around bias and social media and other things that are polarizing, etc., then whatever benefits that person or society could get, it might be kind of dampened or disappear, right? So I think my worry is that because we're not necessarily thinking systemically around some of the fundamental changes, how do you drive the changes? Because we're not necessarily, adjusting education, governance, and incentive structures around some of the things that require probably upgrades. Even if these technology fix or others were to materialize, are they enough to counterbalance everything else, really? And that's where I worry. And I think that's where, for me, and, listen, don't get me wrong. I am a partner in a venture capital fund. I'm based in Silicon Valley. I'm an ex-investment banker. So I'm not trying to, to be moral or anything. But I do see the concerns of society where this kind of over-indexing of what certain of these things can do. The other thing I would say is that I think in the past, when you looked at developments, I think technology played an absolutely key role, and I think it still does, for good, for bad, for neutral. It almost doesn't matter, but it's very determining driver of change, no doubt about it. I do wonder, though, whether there are a lot of other things, both for good and for potential bad, that are not technology related, and where on our dashboards, are we spending enough time on it? So we talked about climate, we talked about geopolitics, societal, intergenerational, nuclear, etc. And these are of a different nature to a degree, and that's the duality of the world, right? And in that duality, how much our worldview is focusing on certain things to the exclusion of others or not.
So isn't that interesting? Even if we solved all the major problems in front of us, we could still have plenty of problems right in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And I think that's really the reality of our complex world. It's not what we like. It's not always what we learn, because a lot of the education is kind of mechanical, Newtonian view of the world, which is, I'm not denying it, but it's true that a lot of our world is more and more the sort of complex sphere. If you kind of follow the distinctions between complicated and complex. Complicated, it's known unknowns, it's linear, it's predictable. In advance if you do something what the outcome is. You have specific questions and a range of answers that answer those questions, and that's kind of the way we like to think about the world. And in a rule-based world, I would say that applied quite often. Now, in a non-rule-based world, and I consider, unfortunately, we're probably entering an era where, you could consider that there are no rules or fewer rules than the past 50, 70 years. And if you then add challenges which are of an exponential nature, these are complex in the sense that they're unknown. You don't know in advance what the outcome is. It's emergent. It's non-linear. So the outcomes can be greater than the input. For good and for bad, by the way. It's not necessarily all negative. So to your point, but some are negative, and we're not necessarily devoting as much effective energy, whether it's maybe we're devoting a lot of time and energy, but not effective on the sort of positive aspects of. So you're right. It's a bit sad, because I see what you're saying. It's like there are a lot of ways we could be addressing what for a long time were considered some of the biggest challenges for humanity, sickness and disease and education, etc. And now there's been a kind of box with additional dynamics and complexities.
I keep thinking about the idea that scientists can create a pill that just makes everything better, but that doesn't mean anybody's going to take it.
True.
Even if it solves the problem and it gives us health and fitness and joy, it can do everything, but we may not believe it, and we may not be willing to take it. So, I keep coming back to this idea that everything is like based on our mental paradigms.
Yeah.
The paradigms we have personally accepted as true, they massively influence what we believe is possible and actually desirable for the future. So who would have believed a long time ago when we were in college that our college philosophy class might be the most important class, that and typing, that we ever take?
Yeah, it's such an astute observation, because that is actually my journey. My journey was I was interested in these topics, and then at some point I kind of felt for a specific type of career, etc. I wouldn't have the time, the energy, or the relevance to be looking into that. And more recently, not only have I found an interest in reconnecting with them, but I would say that I generally believe, and that's a key part of our work at the Disruptive Futurists, I generally believe that you cannot disconnect these anymore, because our whole human condition now is basically cohabitating with some of the things we talked about, and even take AI and decision making, etc. It does wonders, but it also means that it's more difficult to have autonomous decision making. Which to your point, then, in terms of worldviews and how you see the world, in the end, education is a big driver for that. Education in the broad sense, your family, your ecosystem, where you're born, and school, structured, non-structured, etc. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea of agency and to the concerns, because you're right. If you don't, and then again, whose worldview is it? And we can have, all these important debates. But just coming back to the fundamentals, which is today, education is probably not adapted to an unpredictable, constantly changing world. In addition to that, the education which maybe was adapted to the past 50 years is less so because of developments of technology or what have you and future work. So if you put those two together, it kind of reinforces what you're saying is, how important is it? And so the challenge for me is, are we as humanity raising those alarm bells? Are we as humanity giving, outlining pathways to exercise agency? How are we thinking about reinventing education? And there's some incredible things that are taking place. I'm on the board of a nonprofit. You probably know Peter Bishop and Teach the Future, and they're doing incredible things. And in many organizations, Kat and the teams in London with School of International Futures. So there are incredible levers that kind of are trying to multiply change makers through systems and that. But it's not the majority, right? And so your view that you've just expressed and what we've been discussing about philosophy, worldviews and all that, it's become probably the most important thing in the world, and yet it's probably the most manipulated thing in the world, right?
Roger, I want to thank you so much for spending this time going deep with us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thanks for bringing in these important topics to future of business. I agree with you. The future of business is much broader than just business. So these are important topics. Thanks so much, Kevin, for having me.